as the title suggests, we'll just do a deeper dive on the differences between the SAT and ACT, just so you're more familiar with what those tests look like now. And then third goal tonight, just at the end, I'll talk about a testing plan at a high level. I'll give you some general guidelines and some general recommendations, some things for you to think about as you're putting your students' testing plan together. So with that, I will dive in. So I start with this slide. I start here because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests. They are not the be-all, end-all of the college admission process. And what you're looking at here is this is a survey done by NACAC. So NACAC stands for the National Association of College Admission Counselors. They do this survey every year where they're reaching out to college admission folk. And what they're trying to do with this survey is give us a sense of these various factors that you see here on the slide. How do they rank in terms of having considerable or moderate importance? And the NACAC folk, they do this survey every year. And every year, the number one response to this survey is always the same thing. The number one thing that colleges are looking at is the students' grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. The next thing that they're going to look at is what's called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear it referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them at Ridgefield High School? And then you can see where the SAT and ACT scores come in, but I'll just draw your attention to the footnote here. This survey was done in 2019, so this was pre-pandemic. Since the pandemic, the NACAC has not done a more recent survey, and we'll get into this in a minute, but since the pandemic, many schools have gone test optional. So the next time that NACAC does this survey, we are anticipating that this line here, the SAT and ACT, it is going to drop in terms of that percentile where you see it now. But it does give you a little bit of context in terms of how the SAT and ACT were seen by colleges pre-pandemic. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, like 60,000 plus applications now, they are reading the essays that are part of that application. They are reading the counselor recommendations. They are reading the teacher recommendations. They are looking at a student's extracurricular activities, any position of leadership they've had, any work experience that they may have had. And all of these factors are going to get weighed into that final admission decision. And for those of you going through this process for the first time, the term you'll hear around the college admission process is what's called a holistic review. And what they're trying to do with that holistic review is they're trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's GPA, their standardized testing scores, put it in some kind of algorithm or formula, and then make that admission decision based on that number. All of these factors are going to get weighed into that final admission decision. And I do just want to spend a couple minutes talking about test optional schools and the test optional school movement, just to give you a little bit of context and a better understanding in terms of where we are now with the test optional schools. But what a test optional school is and what it means, exactly as the name implies, if your student is applying to a school that is test optional, it's entirely up to your student to decide whether to include standardized testing scores as part of that application or not. So if they feel like their scores are supportive of their application, reflective of the work they're doing day in and day out in school, by all means, they're going to send those scores. The college admission folk will see those scores, consider those scores as part of that application read. But if for whatever reason, just those scores end up coming in lower than what that student was hoping for or what that student was expecting, really not reflective of the type of student that they are or the work that they're doing, they're not obligated to send that score. That test optional college is not going to see that score. It's not going to be part of that read. If they don't include that score, what that means is just that college admission officer is going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of those other aspects of that application, a deeper dive maybe on that transcript, a deeper dive on that rigor. But it's not going to be a red flag to the test optional school. They're not going to think to themselves, okay, students coming from Ridgefield High School, chances are very strong that at some point they would have had a chance to take a standardized test. They're choosing not to submit that score. Therefore, that score must be horrible Therefore, we're not going to admit that student. That's not the way they're going to see that. Again, they're just going to evaluate that application based on what was sent. And what you're looking at here, just to orient us, so this is not an exhaustive list of test optional schools by any stretch of the imagination. I just present this slide to give you the sense that even pre-pandemic, there were many selective schools that had opted to go test optional. And I'll just point out a couple here, like University of Chicago, they went test optional like 4 or 5 admission cycles ago. Bates College and Bowdoin College, they've been test optional for a number of years. I think it's over 10 years now, might be even 15 years plus. So even prior to the pandemic, many selective schools were going test optional. And then that pandemic, it accelerated that trend. So here's where we are now with the test optional schools. So almost all colleges and universities were test optional for the class of 2021 and the class of 2022, so our current seniors. And this was in direct response to the pandemic. Many students in these classes just did not get the opportunity to take tests during the pandemic. Many test dates were canceled and test centers were canceled. So the college admission folk realized it would be completely unfair of us to require standardized testing scores if students did not get the opportunity to take that test. So for the class of 2023, so for our current juniors, there is a little bit of uncertainty in terms of what that test optional landscape is going to look like moving forward. Tests are running, students are getting the opportunity to take these tests. However, we can say with a fair degree of confidence that many colleges that have been test optional are going to extend those test optional policies. So chances are very, very strong that a number of colleges that ultimately end up on your students list is going to continue to be test optional. There are going to be some schools that are probably going to go back to requiring standardized testing, especially some of the larger state schools in the South. We've already heard from some of them. University of Georgia system, for instance, University of Florida system, for instance, University of Texas at Austin, also making some waves that maybe they're going to go back to requiring standardized testing. And it's almost the schools that are test optional now, it's very much they're kind of doing it on a year by year basis. So they're going to probably start announcing what their policies are going to be sort of later in the spring, maybe even early summer. So just something to have on your radar, something just to keep in mind that it is going to be a little bit of a moving target throughout that spring. But again, many colleges are going to continue those policies of being test optional. So the way we want our juniors to see these standardized tests in this test optional context is really encouraging students to see the tests as a chance to show off a little bit. We want them to have an everything to win, nothing to lose mindset. See it as an opportunity to get another objective data point to just show that they're academically ready for the rigors of that particular college or university, but knowing there's going to be schools on their list that are test optional. And if those scores come in lower than what they were hoping or expecting, they're not going to be obligated to send that score. So that's where that everything to win, nothing to lose mindset comes from. There are a couple caveats to the test optional school movement just to be aware of, especially if you're applying to some of those more selective schools that more recently went test optional. Prior to the pandemic, those schools, it might be upwards of 60, 70, 80% of students went ahead and submitted standardized testing scores as part of that application. Obviously, the pandemic made that percentage come way down. But as we, knock on wood here, as we emerge from the pandemic, we do anticipate that the number of students submitting standardized testing scores to these selective colleges is going to start going up again. The other caveat to this is if your student's potentially a recruited athlete, even though they're applying to a test optional school, that college coach might need standardized testing scores from your student. And we don't have time to do a deep dive on that tonight. But the reason for that is those colleges and universities just want to make sure that their recruited athletes and their coaches are reaching out to student athletes that meet a certain academic standard and meet a certain academic threshold. And standardized testing scores can be part of that formula that they use. And then the third kind of caveat for the test optional movement is around this idea of merit aid scholarships. So what merit aid is, it's generally non-need-based financial aid. For those schools that give merit aid, they're using it as a recruitment tool. They're trying to entice strong students to apply and ultimately enroll at their university. So this is just one example that I pulled. This is from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And you can see it's a pretty strong student, 3.5 out of a 4.0 GPA scale. But you can also see as the standardized testing scores go up, you can see the amount of that merit aid award also going up. And I don't want the take-home message from this slide to be, I don't want you to look at this slide and be like, oh my gosh, Drew, so we got to make sure that our students' SAT or ACT scores are as high as humanly possible in order to maximize this aid. It's more just putting it on your radar. That back in my day, when I went through the college admission process, we always thought of standardized testing scores as something that we needed in order to get in. But it's not just necessarily about getting in anymore. It's also potentially about maximizing that aid. And the reason why I talk about merit aid here, after talking about test optional schools, is just be aware that there are some schools that admit test optionally, but when they consider these merit aid awards, they might be factoring in standardized testing scores. And the college admission folk, they try to be as upfront and transparent in their policies as they can. So if you're applying to a school that's test optional that you know gives merit aid, you can just ask them, do they consider standardized testing scores in those awards or not? And they'll tell you what their policies are. And again, I'm going to cover a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan, it's answering three pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And if you can answer these three questions, hopefully it just reduces some of the stress around the standardized testing for your students. Just students knowing when they need to have them on their radar and knowing when they need to be taking them can go a long way in terms of reducing some of that anxiety around these tests. And you'll hear me come back to this point, but I do want to make it now. I know there is huge pressure out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, and start that process earlier, and earlier. But keep in mind that performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So the later students take these tests, statistically speaking, the better they perform on it. So what that means for our students is most students are going to peak on these tests later in spring of junior year, possibly into that fall of senior year. And then the other point that I want to make around the testing plan is at the end of the day, that quote, perfect testing plan is what works best for your student and what works best for you as a family. There are many different paths to success here. So please do not worry if your testing plan ends up being a little bit different than what a best friend is doing, what a neighbor is doing, or possibly even what an older sibling did. Again, many paths to success here. That quote, perfect plan is what works best and is customized for what your student needs. So when we're talking about the standardized testing landscape, these are the tests that we're talking about. So PSAT, really just for practice. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. Some schools give the pre-ACT, again, just for practice to give students some exposure to an ACT. SAT, ACT is going to be the bulk of what I talk about tonight. You'll notice subject tests has a line through it. So subject tests, these were hour-long curriculum-based tests. They went by different names. Back in my day, they were called achievement tests. They were also called SAT-2s. More recently, they were called subject tests. The reason why they have a line through it is in January of this year, the College Board kind of saw the writing on the wall with these subject tests. Fewer and fewer colleges were considering them or looking for subject test scores. Fewer and fewer students were taking subject tests. So the College Board in January announced that they were getting rid of them. We all cheered, quite honestly, when they made that announcement. Subject tests, they always seem to cause a lot of anxiety for students. You know, do I need to take them? If I do need to take them, which content areas should I take them in? When should I take them? Kind of what scores am I looking for? And all of that has now gone out the window. You don't need to worry about any of it. Colleges are keenly aware that subject tests no longer exist and students can't take them. So they are not expecting subject test scores from your students because obviously they don't have the opportunity to take those tests. And then AP, just a little bit outside the scope of what we're going to have time to talk about tonight. But if you have questions around AP exams, or please don't hesitate to type them in that chat box. So I'm going to start with the PSAT. Really just for practice for that SAT. Anytime students get an opportunity to take a standardized test under real conditions, it's always good practice for them, especially when it doesn't count. And juniors who took it in October, they'll get their PSAT scores back in early December. And when those scores come back, students immediately kind of focus on that top line score. And I totally get why they do that. Like, what was my PSAT math score? What was my PSAT verbal score? But the real benefit of the PSAT, it's not so much in that top line score. It's more in the itemized score report that students will get back that will show every question they answered correctly, every question that they missed. And if students have the discipline to go back through that score report, do a deeper dive on it, just at a higher level, it will give them an overall sense of their strengths, also their weaknesses, those areas they want to improve upon before they take these tests for real later in the spring of junior year. And then just real quickly on the scoring of it, you can kind of tell by the way this slide is organized, but these tests are all what they're called vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT, as it is the score your student would have gotten had they taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, if they got a 600 math, 600 verbal on that PSAT, that 1200 would have been their SAT score. But keep in mind, students are taking this test October of junior year. They're not going to peak on this until late spring of junior year or fall of senior year. So I always try to reassure students, don't be too disappointed if that score comes in a little bit lower than what you were hoping or what you were expecting. Where you start on a PSAT and where you ultimately end up on an SAT or even on an ACT is often two different places. But it does give the student a baseline score. It does give them a sense in terms of where they're starting in this process. And then I include this slide just to remind us that at the end of the day, colleges do not care. They do not have a preference for the SAT or the ACT. They accept both tests equally. They do not see one test as a superior test and one test as an inferior test. They do not care if students apply with an SAT or an ACT. And for those of you totally new to this process, the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either the SAT or the ACT. You got to think about this a little bit as like Coke versus Pepsi here. It's two separate tests, two separate organizations. As you can see, they are in a market share battle with one another. But at the end of the day, it's entirely up to your student to decide if they want to focus on an SAT or focus on an ACT. And here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests, just so you can get a feel for them. And just looking at this slide, you can get a sense they are long. So part of students hitting their full potential on these tests is just building their stamina. Can they focus and hang in there for a full 3 hours? But you'll also notice there is a lot of overlap in terms of the content on these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophy behind these tests. So the SAT is more of what we consider a power test. The reading on that SAT is more challenging than what's on the ACT. The questions are a little bit harder, a little bit more misdirection on that SAT, a little bit trickier questions on that SAT compared to the ACT. Where the ACT, the difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that test. And to give you a sense of that, in some ways, you can get a feel for that by just looking at that reading section on that SAT and comparing it to that reading section on the ACT. So they're comparable in length in terms of number of passages and also in terms of number of questions. But you can see on the SAT, students get 65 minutes for that, whereas on the ACT, students only get 35 minutes for that. Again, that difference between that power on the SAT compared to that speed of that ACT. Other notable differences here, that math no calc. No calc stands for no calculator. The SAT, they're not trying to torment students by taking their calculator away, more just testing their ability. Can they actually do math without the use of that calculator? And then they get their calculator back for that second section. ACT, a little bit more student friendly. Students are allowed a calculator throughout, but again, the difficulty is the pace of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions. It's about 1 minute per question. Also on the ACT, you'll notice there's this separate science section. It's not science per se. It's not what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more deductive reasoning and logic. Can students work their way through a scientific passage of which they might not know anything about that particular science topic, but using the tables, the figures, and the graphs and the information contained in that passage? The idea of it is as they answer those questions, they'll have a better understanding of what that passage is about. You can see no separate science section on that SAT. I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of how the SAT is trying to incorporate some science throughout. Other notable difference on that SAT, you can see that optional essay also has a line through it. When the College Board announced that they were getting rid of subject tests, they also announced that they were getting rid of that essay. Same story. Colleges weren't looking at that essay score. They weren't using it. Just totally unclear as to kind of the value of that essay. So the College Board announced that they were getting rid of it. We kind of keep waiting for the ACT to make a similar announcement that they are going to get rid of their optional writing portion. They haven't made that announcement yet, but the same story holds true. Colleges, they're not looking for that ACT writing section, not putting any weight on that separate ACT writing section score. So our general advice for students, if they're going down an ACT path, is to not worry about that optional writing section, to focus their efforts on the multiple choice here. Real quickly on the scoring of it, SAT 200 to 800. On what's called evidence-based reading and writing. That's a mouthful. I'm just going to call it verbal. So 200 to 800 on verbal, 200 to 800 on math. So the SAT's back to that 400 to 1600 point scale. The ACT, if you're not familiar with it, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges care about is the composite score. And that composite score is just the average. So just the average of that English, math, reading, and science scores. Again, that optional writing is a total standalone score, not factored into that total or that average composite score. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to take you through some side-by-side comparisons of some sample questions from the SAT and ACT, just so you can get a sense in terms of how that power on the SAT compares to that speed of that ACT. And I'm going to date myself a little bit with this joke here. But the SAT writing and language and ACT English, this is the grammar portions of the test. These are the two sections that are most similar to one another. And back in my day, like, I had like a fountain pen and I learned to write in cursive of all things. And we wrote things like, "Dear Sir." Today's day and age, it's all communicating via texting and emojis and things. So both the SAT and ACT just want to make sure that our students have learned some grammar and have been exposed to some grammar rules. So this is what it looks like on the ACT. SAT looks identical to this, where students are given passages with various grammatical errors and asked to correct those errors as they go through it. We're not going to, don't worry, I'm not going to call on anybody. I'm not going to unmute anybody suddenly and ask them to solve this. This is more just to give you a feel for it. But number 8 here is verb tense. Number 9 is punctuation. Do students know the correct usage of a colon or a semicolon? Again, this is from the ACT, but that SAT writing and language looks identical to this. And the differences between that SAT reading and ACT reading, in some ways, we've already talked about this. It really comes down to the timing of it. So on that SAT, students have 65 minutes, whereas on that ACT reading section, they only have 35 minutes. And in the world of standardized testing, you can imagine just a huge difference between having 65 minutes on a section or 35 minutes on a section. So just by knowing that, you can probably guess that that SAT reading is going to be harder than what's on that ACT. It's going to require a closer reading, a deeper reading, a more analytical reading, more questions along these lines. What can reasonably be inferred? And then for some of these questions, there'll be a follow-up question: which choice provides the best evidence? There's actually going to be line numbers in these answer choices. Again, forcing students to go back, do a deeper reading, a closer reading, almost a line-by-line reading of that passage. Whereas the ACT, they really don't have time for that. More questions along these lines. The passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can students show that they read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that that author was trying to make? Which then brings us to everyone's favorite, the math sections of these two tests. And these are both about slope of the line. And I choose these two questions just because I think they do a nice job of highlighting that power of the SAT versus that speed of that ACT. So this is the way the SAT question goes. And I'll just read it just so you can hear it. But it goes like this. The graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a, 0, and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? And most students have the same reaction that we all have, especially when I read it like that, which is generally like, Drew, like what? Like what on earth? Like I have no idea. I have no idea what this is even asking me. So the SAT, they could have asked this in a more straightforward way. They could have simply said the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would read it and be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But this is where the trickiness and the misdirection comes in. For students to figure that out, they have to figure out this whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b and how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas the ACT, just way less interested in playing that misdirection game. Much more straightforward of a question. Students are given 2 lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3, and then students are asked to find the slope of that perpendicular line. And you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes, or you don't. If you do remember it, you know it's C, -1/3. If you don't remember it, you're choosing your favorite ACT letter and moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head here. There's no trying to figure out what this question is actually asking. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between that speed of the ACT compared to that power on that SAT. Other notable differences on the math between these two tests. SAT has a much narrower and deeper focus. 60 to 70% of the math on that SAT is algebra. So algebra 1 and algebra 2. Again, that no calculator section, not trying to torment students, just trying to measure their math fluency. Can they actually do math without the use of a calculator? Whereas the ACT, it has a much broader and shallower focus. Only 30% is algebra, way more geometry on that ACT compared to that SAT. Calculator allowed throughout. But again, the difficulty comes from the pace of it. It's 60 minutes, it's 60 questions, it's about 1 minute per question. Which then brings us to that ACT science section. And by design, the ACT science section, it does have a tendency to kind of take students' breaths away a little bit. So most students' reaction to that ACT science section is usually like, Drew, there is just no way. There is no way in 35 minutes I'm going to be able to answer 40 questions that pertain to figures or graphs that look something like this. It's not actually as bad as it seems. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to answer this question. So really what I need to do is just kind of simplify this a little bit. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core. So my first assignment is to find the outer core, which has to be this between these 2 dashed lines. And then I know how to read a graph. So I know I'm on the y-axis there in terms of the temperature. So I know I'm between these 2 dashed lines. I know I'm between these 2 points. So I know that answer choice is C, 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I have found. I have no idea what that answer choice actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students can struggle with the ACT because it's such a fast-paced test. The ACT has the tendency to turn on everyone's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this, which is, Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this or triple check this or quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them strategies and approaches, it's also building their confidence up that they can see a question like this and without any hesitation or doubt, circle answer choice C and then move on to that next question. So again, no separate science section on that SAT. A little bit forced the way the SAT test science. Again, keep in mind my background here, because I'm totally biased when I talk about this. But according to the College Board or according to the SAT, students are demonstrating their understanding of science if they can interpret a table. I might argue there might be a little bit more involved to science than just reading data from a table. But even though we're in the writing and language or the grammar portion of this test, they're going to have what they call these data graphic questions, where students are going to be asked to manipulate or interpret data, thereby demonstrating their understanding of science. So again, a lot of overlap in terms of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of their approaches. So the SAT questions being more of a power test, more challenging questions, more challenging reading, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the algebra in that math section, but more time per question. Whereas the ACT questions more straightforward, but does require that instant recognition, as we saw with that slope of the line question and that science question. Broader scope of skills, again, more geometry, more math topics on that ACT math. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish, which then brings us to the $1 million question. And the $1 million question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew, so we know colleges accept both tests equally. So if we can pick a test, if we can decide we're going down an SAT path or an ACT path, we can think of it as taking that potential amount of work and potential number of tests that we're going to take and cutting that in half. But which test should we focus on? Should we go down an SAT path? Should we go down an ACT path? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student's going to prefer the SAT, this type of student's going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both, ideally in a practice setting. So for juniors, you've gotten exposure to that SAT with that PSAT. We do offer free ACT practice tests out of our New Canaan office and also out of our White Plains office, and we can also just send it home to you. So I encourage students, if they just want to get a feel for what an ACT looks like and for a score on that ACT, please don't hesitate to reach out to us to set up that practice. ACT is totally free. We do full-length practice SATs as well, so please take advantage of those also. And then there is a concordance table, so you can compare an SAT score to an ACT score. And again, keep in mind, you can use a PSAT score as a proxy for that SAT score. And I know this is a little bit small, so I'm just going to blow up part of the chart here just to orient us. But a 24 out of 36 on that ACT, it's the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT. And then 30 out of 36 on that ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. So then in terms of when to take them. So this is when the tests are offered. You can see they're offered every single month with the exception of January. SAT recently added a test in August. ACT recently added a national testing date in July. So hooray, there's summer testing dates now if your student wants to take advantage of those. But I cannot stress this enough. Please, 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 please do not have this be your student's standardized testing plan. No one wants students to take these tests 6, 7, 8, 9 times. There's no need for that. The scores don't just keep going up and up and up and up and up every time students take the test. At a certain point, the scores start to plateau. At a later point, they can even start to dip. And that's when the anxiety on these tests can really start to mount. Most students aren't one and done on these tests just because the first time they take it, they're always a little bit nervous. But most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that fall of senior year. And another just kind of high level guideline is just earlier in the process, if you can get a sense of whether or not your student's going to focus on that SAT or focus on that ACT. We're also just trying to avoid going like ACT to SAT to ACT to SAT to ACT, and then kind of rinse, lather, repeat in that fall of senior year. And I will just point out just the SAT is Connecticut state assessment test. So all juniors in public schools in the state of Connecticut will take an SAT as part of the school day in either late March or early April. So even if you go down an ACT path, you'll still get that opportunity to try an SAT through that state assessment test. So we don't want to do this. We want to do something more sane and sensible. So Here's just one sample plan just to give you a feel in terms of how we kind of take this and again do something a little bit more sane and sensible. So this student came to us before the start of junior year, just did a practice SAT and a practice ACT, scored equally well on both tests, as many students do. So keep in mind 70 to 80% of students are going to score equally well on both tests. So often the decision whether to go down an SAT path or to go down an ACT path, it really comes down to a student gut instinct. We kind of joke with them, sort of, which one did you kind of hate the least? You know, which one do you think you'll have an easier time with? Which one do you think, if you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which one do you think you're going to have an easier time getting a score more reflective of what you're doing day in and day out in school? So this student did that over the summer. Again, for juniors on the call, do not worry, you're not behind. You have that October PSAT. You'll get that back in early December. If you want to take a practice ACT to get exposure and a score on that test. And then you can compare that PSAT score to that practice ACT score. And now you're off and running in terms of deciding, are you going SAT or are you going ACT in that spring? So this student scored equally well on both, but had a slight preference for the SAT. So we went down that SAT path, targeted that state assessment test in either March, late March or early April for the first attempt. June for the second attempt, was in some AP classes. So we did build in the AP tests in May as part of his testing plan. And then, as with many students, just did not feel at the end of junior year that he had a score that was truly reflective. So wanted to try it one third and final time in August before the start of senior year. And then an ACT prep plan is going to look very similar to this. Again, you'll still have that SAT as part of the state assessment test, but then most students are targeting February, April, or June and picking two of those dates for that ACT in late spring. And then again, fall of senior year for that third and final time as needed. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, something along these lines. And then just in the last couple minutes that I have here, I do just want to go over score choice and super scoring, just so you're familiar with those terms. So almost all schools honor what we call score choice. So what that means is if a school is requiring standardized testing scores, and if a student's taken the test more than once, students can choose which test scores they actually send on to colleges. So for instance, you know, if a student was thinking they were going down an ACT path and they took that SAT as part of the state assessment test and maybe it didn't go so well, they're not going to be obligated to send that SAT score to that college. That college is not going to see that that SAT score. So almost all colleges honor score choice. We're over well over 97%. And certainly the pandemic, with almost all schools going test optional, has in some ways made this point moot. But just to give you a little bit of context, prior to the pandemic, there were some schools out there that did want to see all scores. It was never entirely clear as to why they wanted to see all scores. I think it was just trying to get a sense of a student's testing history. So for that student who was like, Drew, I totally hear you, you know, taking these tests 8, 9, 10 times, completely insane, but I don't care. If that's what it takes, that's what I'm going to do. Just knowing that there may be a school on their list that would see that, hopefully it would get that student to rethink that plan, do something a little bit more sane and sensible. And then the other reason why there were schools that wanted to see all scores, it was because they were in fact super scoring. So what schools that super scoring, what that means is if a student's taken the test more than once, they'll send the full score reports from the different times that they've taken the test. But for that college that super scores, what they're going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though the student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting on that SAT, for colleges that super score the SAT, and it's over 90% now, that 1290 is going to be that student's SAT score. And there are a couple of reasons why colleges super score. One, you got to keep in mind that college admission folk, they read applications supportively. They're looking for reasons to admit students, and super scoring is one way in which they can look at the standardized testing piece in that most supportive light. The other reason why schools are super scoring is you have to keep in mind it is in the college's best interest to be able to publish as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. We all kind of loathe the US News and World Report rankings, but standardized testing is still part of those rankings. So super scoring is one way in which they can guarantee to be able to publish as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. And let me just reassure you that for those colleges that super score, they are in fact super scoring. They're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to trick you into sending more score reports so they can see the 580, they can see the 640, ask themselves which one's the real one. Is it 580? Is it 640? Should we average them together? They're going to cherry pick that highest subsection score each and every time. And then super scoring on the ACT. Fewer colleges are super scoring the ACT. I think we're above 70% now. But every single admission cycle, more and more schools are accepting ACT super scoring, and we anticipate that that trend is going to continue. But super scoring for the ACT, it works the exact same way. Student took the test 3 times, sends the full score report. For that college that super scores the ACT, they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and then recalculate that composite. So same story, even though the student did not get a 31 in a single administration of that ACT, for those colleges that super score, that 31 is going to be that student's ACT score. And then in terms of how and when to prepare for these tests, just as we want to do something sane and sensible with students taking the tests, we also want to do something sane and sensible for any prep that students do. We don't want to prep for these tests for a year, year and a half, 2 years. It's too much. It's just students have better things to do with their time. So most students, depending on their starting score and on where they're ultimately hoping to end up, most students are going to prep for about 6 to 15 weeks going into that first official test. And this is where that recommendation, again, of holding off on the testing till later in spring of junior year comes into play a little bit, because all the work that students are doing day in and day out in school is also helping them prepare for these tests. So we want to build on that and then use the prep just as an opportunity to hone in on some weaknesses, just to give them some strategies for the actual SAT or ACT. So again, just as we want to do something sane and sensible on the testing side, also something sane and sensible on any test prep that students do. So in terms of what goes into test prep, it's 3 major areas. So one is content, just knowing all the grammar rules that are on the test, knowing all the math that's on the test, for instance. Also some strategy, just having a game plan for every section and every question. And then that best form of practice is practice, practice, practice on officially retired tests. And the SAT, they've partnered with Khan Academy, and through that partnership, they've developed a really nice online program for students who are self-motivated. And through that partnership, they've released 10 official practice tests. So full tests, full scales, full answer explanations. So for students who want to get started on their own, that's a great place to start. So ACT, they have something similar. It's a little bit more low tech. It's the Red Book. It's the official guide to the ACT. There's 5 official practice tests in there. Same story, full tests, full scales, full answer explanations. You can also find another 3 or 4 tests online as well. So again, for students who are looking to get started, that's often a good place for them to start. So I know we've covered a lot of ground. I hope this was helpful. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. But just to sum up what we've talked about at a high level, again, most students are going to score the same, regardless of whether they go SAT or ACT. But if it's a little bit of upfront investment, but if earlier in the process, students can decide whether they're going SAT or ACT and focus on that test, it's taking the potential amount of work and cutting that in half. But keep in mind that any work that students do on one test is going to help with that other, because there is so much overlap in content between these 2 tests. And I know I've said this a number of times, but I know there is huge pressures out there for just early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 and start that earlier, earlier, and earlier. But again, performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So most students are going to peak on these tests late spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. And when students are most ready to take these tests, that's when I want them to take them. And I just leave you with this. We know that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the students' grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It does not do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say on this side of the computer, but really at the end of the day, these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college application process, especially as students are going to continue to be applying in this test optional environment. We really want them to see the test as a chance to show off a little bit. Think of them as everything to win, nothing to lose, knowing that there's going to be schools on their lists where they're not going to have to send standardized testing scores. And then also, you could not be in better hands than with the guidance team at Ridgefield High School. Just tons of experience working with students and working with families and guiding them through this process. We've partnered with them now for a number of years, and you could not have a better resource available to you. And then again, my email is here. So I'm sure we have some questions that have come in, but if you're rewatching the recording, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. As you can tell, we'd love to talk shop. We'd love to be a resource for families and guide them through this. So my email is there. And then also, please take advantage of the free practice tests. We offer them every weekend out of our New Canaan office in White Plains, New York office. But we can also we can send them to you at home and have students take it online as well, if that's easier. So that's often a great place to start for students in terms of just getting a practice test under their belt and getting a place to start. And for sophomores, any younger students on the call, it's always good to get this information, but just keep in mind, it is early, right? You don't need to be worrying about taking these tests now. The earliest I would think about it is over the summer after sophomore year. Again, we're not starting prep then, but if you want to get a little bit of a jump on it, you can do a practice SAT, practice ACT, and at least start thinking, are we going SAT or are we going ACT kind of later in that spring of junior year. But the focus, obviously, it's got to be on academics, has to be on extracurricular activities. Do not worry about the standardized testing piece now. It's too early for that. All right, Terry, I think we did it.
Drew, you did. And, a virtual round of applause for you there. That was wonderful. At the very beginning, I told everybody to just, breathe through it. And it sounds like you took a breath and then you haven't stopped since 7:06. So it's now your opportunity to breathe. We did get a couple of questions that came in. People are raising their hand, but I would invite you to use the chat box. I'm going to go with that first. The question is, many of our children have not done any midterms or final exams. Is this a nationwide trend, and how will it affect them? Do you want to start that off, Drew?
Yeah, so part of these tests is just the length of it and stamina of them. But that's where the practice test can really be helpful. Like if students have the discipline to take a practice test and do it from start to finish, and not like every single week, because it's just too much. Students will burn out on it. Generally, we recommend kind of like, in terms of practice tests, maybe 3, or maybe 4 if students are particularly anxious. Just 1 in the beginning of the program, 1 in the middle, and then kind of 1 at the end as like a full dress rehearsal. But doing those practice tests will help kind of build up that stamina. And you're not alone. Many schools, in the pandemic, they got rid of finals and they got rid of midterms and things because there was logistically no real way to kind of administer those tests. But don't worry, just being back this fall, students are getting kind of back into the routine of like a full school day and then extracurricular activities, and just they are starting to rebuild that stamina that maybe they lost a little bit with the virtual learning.
Yeah, and if I could piggyback on that, it's factual. I don't really know of any institution that maintained the same type of testing structure that we had pre-pandemic. And a number of high schools are going back to semester exams, things along those lines. And they're doing it with conversations, et cetera, because while we are back in the building, It's really anything but normal. Everybody still has a mask on. There occasionally you'll get emails with regards to those cases that pop up here and there. So we're still in an abnormal stage, and students are back in the building, but they're still not back socially, emotionally, academically. It is a process. And that's one of the things that I heard you talk about, Drew, is this is a process. This is not a one-off event. And please do keep that in mind. It doesn't all, you saw that chart at the very beginning, that 90% of college admissions counselors are still looking at the students' grades overall, and then, the curriculum, and then the SAT and ACT test scores. So, it's all in perspective. It's all a process. Did I see some hands go up?
And then I think there was maybe one more question that came in at the end. Let's see, you mentioned the Red Book. Yeah, so for the practice for the ACT, its official title is the official guide to the ACT. You can pick it up from like Amazon. There's 5 official tests there. And then yes, Khan Academy for students who are self-motivated. The SAT or the College Board has partnered with Khan Academy. And through that partnership, there's a lot of online just sort of practice that students can do, and also those practice tests. And you can find the SAT practice tests online as well. You don't necessarily need to go through Khan Academy to get those.
Wonderful. So in addition to Drew's information, I am typing in the chat my email address at the high school. So you're more than welcome to contact your child's school counselor. It's always first initial, last name at ridgefieldps.net. So I am the chair of the school counseling department, and if you'd like, I can direct your questions to your child's school counselor. But there's a lot of information that I might be able to address as well. One of the things I do want to share with junior parents is that in December, we haven't narrowed down a date or a time. We will be doing a junior parents presentation with regards to pre-college planning. And I did see another question come in. Drew, my children's math teacher said they should take the SAT at the end of freshman year because Algebra 2 would be fresh. What do you think? And this is going to pit you against a
so. And again, keep in mind, right? This is when I say, like, at the end of the day, there's many paths, right? And that quote perfect plan, might be different than what someone else ends up doing. So just keep that in mind. The plans that I present, it's general overall kind of guidance. It's end of sophomore year. It does feel a little bit early to me. Just again, everything they're doing in school is going to help them. And you can imagine where a student is in like late spring of sophomore year versus where they are just in terms of maturity at the end of junior year. And they're not going to forget their math. So if they're going into an honors pre-calculus junior year, they might need to refresh, some of the math topics, but they're not going to totally lose it. But if your student feels ready, especially with SUPERSCORING, if your student feels ready that they are going to absolutely crush that SAT math section, by all means, there's nothing stopping them from trying an SAT. The one thing that I would say is before maybe you have your student do that is to have your student try an official practice SAT just to kind of see where they're actually scoring. Because sometimes students, they feel like they're ready, but it's one thing to feel like you're ready, and it's another thing to actually be able to do it under timed conditions. So at least that practice test, it will give you it will give you an accurate baseline score if they do it timed under real conditions in terms of where that math is actually coming in. And then the other thing is just, again, take this with a giant grain of salt because every student is different. Mm-hmm. The one thing about early testing, even with score choice and everything, is sometimes what can happen is students can go in there and be like, look, like, I'm just going to try it. I'm just going to see kind of what score I get. I know I'm not going to have to share it with colleges. So what's the big deal? But sometimes what can happen is students get that score And it's lower than what they were expecting or what they were hoping. And even though they went in with that mentality of, I'm just going to try it, like, why not? I got nothing to lose. What ends up happening is they see that score that comes in lower than what they were expecting, and suddenly they start panicking a little bit. And they're like, oh my gosh, like, I thought I was going to get an 800. I got a 610. And it's just because they took it at the end of sophomore year. It doesn't mean that they don't know math or can't do math. And suddenly they put pressure on themselves, and suddenly they're kind of off to the races. And without that intention, suddenly that early and often testing can start coming into play, because now they prep all over the summer. And then they're like, well, I did all this prep, and now I want to try an August test. And then maybe the August test doesn't go so well. And they're like, well, now at least I'm going to take it in November. And suddenly the intent was, why not? Let's just try it, see how it goes. But in reality, what ended up happening is it started becoming early and often testing. And instead of, reducing the anxiety around these tests, it ended up raising it. But again, it's going to be different for every student. So just keep that in mind as well.
The really interesting experience about living in a community that is focused on education is sometimes we as parents, I'm a parent myself, is we hear about what other people are doing. And all of us come to the stage with the best intentions. We want to give our kids everything. And if we hear something from somebody else, that may touch something within us that says, oh, I'm not doing this for my child. So at the end of the day, Drew is an expert. I've been in the field for sometimes way too many years, I think, but you know your kids best. And a lot of times it really comes down to that conversation. Just because one teacher said something, just because Drew said something, be thoughtful, be mindful in this process, and know that while a score may, be a certain number, it can also have an impact on your child. So I reiterate Drew's point. You got to keep in mind that if they test way too young, there's the potential that it could, have an impact on them, because then they start at that baseline thinking, oh boy, I thought I was really going to get this score. So any more questions? Okay, Drew, any final thoughts from you?
No, thanks everybody. I so appreciate your taking the time. I know it was a lot at a very, very fast pace. But so appreciate your attention and the questions that came in.
Yeah, folks, there were almost 70 people who were on this session, and when we got to Q&A, there were just about mid-60s or so. And we still have almost 40 people who are staying on. So as fast as it was, Drew, you definitely said some things that were incredibly valuable. So folks, we thank you so much for your time. Again, please look for this on RHS Counseling on YouTube at some point tomorrow. I will put that information out there. Again, please feel free to contact Drew at Summit Educational Group, or me, T. Houlihan at ridgefieldps.net. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Stay warm. Go Tigers.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So appreciate it.
Have a wonderful evening, folks. Let's give folks a chance to just log off.
And then Terry, do you want to stop recording? I think we're...
Yeah. Stop it.